Thank you very much to TOC for the invitation to speak here, and thank you very much to Rotterdam City and the Port of Rotterdam for holding this event. It's a pleasure to be back in this great port city. My presentation kind of follows the theme of the session this afternoon: big ships, big alliances, big challenges. And when we're talking about those big challenges, what have we got? We've got much bigger ships, we've got much bigger alliances, and we've got vessel cascading, so we've got a triple whammy of challenges all together in one. And that's combination, the dynamism of those three factors is really what's driving everything and everything that follows in this conference, really. In terms of bigger ships, and much bigger ships, of course, I should emphasize, I've shown this slide before, but it's interesting that it's morphed into something slightly different now, because we had this situation where Maersk would build a bigger ship, and 3 to 5 years later, others followed, and that happened again with the MMS Clask. And then with the Triple E's, other carriers followed. So we've seen this same process going on each time. But what's different now is that Maersk have been leapfrogged. Other carriers have leaped ahead of them in terms of ship size, and the cycle is getting much faster. It used to take 3 to 5 years for other carriers to catch up. Now they're catching up in 1 to 2 to 3 years and leaping ahead. So the cycle is changing and getting faster as well. And has the cycle finished? Well, we've heard a lot about much bigger ships beyond the 20,000, 21,000 that's in the order book at the moment. I'm not really brave enough to stand here and say it's going to stop at 21,000 TEU. I don't think anybody can be that bold. The pressure to go bigger is going to be there, but I do sense there is a kind of hesitation now. We've reached a kind of point at this 19, 20, 21,000 TEU vessel size. It seems to be a kind of break point, and there's a hesitation about going beyond that, particularly because of the vessel length implications. I think going beyond the 400 meters up to maybe 430, 440 meters is a really big step, I think, for ports and terminals in particular to cope with. Bigger alliances, we know all about these, don't we? The big four alliances that have emerged. But the key questions are, how long will they stay as they are, and are they really stable? In other words, will there be any more convergence, regulatory permissions notwithstanding? But will there be any further changes? I think Andrew Penfold alluded to this earlier on. If there's changes to ownership, mergers, the alliances could restructure. They aren't necessarily going to be like this forever. And then vessel cascading, the other big thing in the equation. We all know a lot about cascading. I think the key thing is, in terms of vessel sizes, is that in percentage terms, the really big growth in vessel sizes has been actually on the north-south trade routes. We've all seen the big ships growing on the Asia-Europe route, but actually it's the north-south ports, particularly Latin America, that have seen the most extraordinary explosion in ship size over the last sort of 3 to 5 years. So everybody's affected by this, not just a few ports, not just a few terminals. It's a global phenomenon. So those are the three key themes that we're all very familiar with, but just to drill down a little bit more in detail in terms of what's the key themes in terms of demand growth. The theme of this presentation is big challenges, and the big challenge used to be dealing with really high growth rates. Back in the 2000s, when we were looking at double-digit growth every year, that was the big challenge. How do we cope with 10%, 15% growth per annum? That's not so much an issue now. We're down in the sort of 4 or 5% margin growth rate. So growth not such a big issue to deal with, although the scale of the industry is such that even a 5% growth is a lot of TEU added to the market. And there are, of course, some very wide regional variations within that. So, drill down a bit more, gets a bit more interesting. But there's also this question of transshipment, which I think is very interesting, and it's cropped up a few times today already. Bigger ships and alliances, does that mean more, or actually does it mean less transshipment? We've had an interesting discussion within Drewry over the last few weeks about this, because you can certainly argue that to fill up the big ships, you need to use more hub and spoke transshipment to try and draw in more cargo to fill the ships. And you can also argue that there's probably more opportunity for relay transshipment with more interconnecting services with very big ships that need to be filled. You can, exploit more relay transshipment. But the counter-argument to that is as John mentioned in his introduction, multi-port cooling is still the norm. We haven't really seen any move towards single port hubbing in a major market like North Europe. It's still multi-port cooling, so there's no move towards transshipping in that sense. And also, I think very interestingly, the bigger alliances actually create more direct port pairs than there were before. So you can get your cargo from A to B without transshipping more easily with the bigger alliances. So in effect, that's working against transshipment and reducing transshipment in some cases. So there's sort of pluses and minuses going on in terms of transshipment, which may in fact net each other out. But again, you've got to drill down to the micro level to see what effect it has on an individual market or port. One thing that is very clear about demand is demand peaks. We've heard quite a few mentions of this already today, haven't we? And it is really a very significant issue for the industry. Bigger ships, cargo being consolidated, it's leading to a reduced frequency of service and bigger peaks. The statistics and the service patterns show that. And it's leading to some extraordinary numbers that ports and terminals have to deal with. This one I've used before because I like it, and it's an extreme case, and I think it's actually been beaten now. I think there was a slightly bigger exchange here in Rotterdam than this 10,500 boxes exchange. So it's about 17,500 TEU exchanged on a single call. Quite a lot of boxes to load and unload on a single call at ECT here in Rotterdam. But a good job was done, 150 berth moves per hour, very respectable performance by ECT. But even on that basis, that ship was in port for nearly 3 days. So the amount of port time that these peaks create is highly significant. We used to do our network modeling with, a typical port call was 24 hours or even 12 hours. That used to be the norm 15 years ago. Of course, now 24 hours, 36, 48, 72-hour port calls. The whole nature of the port equation is changing. Just a word of caution, though, on the question of peaks. The pattern of arrivals is all important, I think, when we talk about peaks, because if you take this instance, you could say, if you're a terminal and on a Monday you used to have 2 ships calling, each with 3,000 boxes, and instead of that you now have 1 ship calling with 6,000 boxes, you can argue, well, nothing's changed really. You're still getting 6,000 boxes on a Monday. There is no peak, there's no change. But of course, if it was this picture instead, you used to have a 3,000 box ship on a Monday and another one on a Thursday, and instead it's all now on a Monday, then your peaking really is starting to get evident. And it's getting even more evident if the ships aren't on schedule either. Then, the whole system really starts to feel the pain. So peaking, I think, is an absolutely critical element in all of this. Big challenges is the theme. Obviously, big challenges in terms of equipment and infrastructure. The implications for ports, as we all know, are highly significant in terms of both CapEx and OpEx, which are both increasing as a result of bigger ships. Because of all these factors on the list, all the equipment and productivity pressures, etc. But I've highlighted there, larger or more densely stacked yard, because I think it is the yard that is really feeling the pain of the peaks. That's where the pressure is felt, and that's where we're seeing the situation where a terminal which was designed 10 years ago with a certain key length and yard size isn't now fit for purpose, because you need the same key length, but you need a bigger yard. So the parameters, the relationship between key and yard is changing. And you can't always just extend your yard, or you may not want to. Land is expensive, land may not be available. So the yard is the critical element. And the other thing I would say in this context, of course, is there's much more rapid obsolescence of existing terminal capacity. Terminal capacity has always become obsolescent over time. You go to any major well-established port, and the older terminals eventually, aren't fit for purpose, and new terminals, usually downstream, emerge. But this process is happening much more quickly, and we're seeing relatively modern terminals being walked away from, like the MSC terminal in Antwerp behind the locks. 5 million TEU, modern terminal, very well equipped, very efficient, is now considered not fit for purpose. And, the traffic is being transferred into a new terminal. So this obsolescence of terminal capacity is a really key issue as well, I think. Having said all that about the need for bigger cranes and deeper water and all this fancy expensive stuff, it's also true to say that the traditional ports aren't out of the game, even if they have navigational restrictions. So Antwerp sees very big vessels calling. Hamburg, again, tidal and draft restrictions, but 19,000 TEU ships are calling in Hamburg. So the big ships are still accessing the restricted ports. And it's the same in elsewhere in the world, in Latin America. Some pictures here of 7,500 TEU ships squeezing in and out of Itajaí in Brazil. It's a tight squeeze, but it's happening. And then this one is my current favorite and has been for a while, a near 10,000 TEU ship squeezing into one of the most draft restricted ports in the world, Buenos Aires, and it's being handled at a terminal with mobile harbour cranes. It just shows what can be done and what is being done to cope with these bigger ships in ports that, weren't designed to handle them but are still managing to do so. And just to sort of hammer home the point, just an interesting sort of scan of our database of the list of ports that are handling ships of 8,000 to 10,000 TEU in South America and several other locations on sort of east-west and secondary trade routes, north-south. And it's quite a list of ports that are getting very big ships calling. Some of those names may not be that familiar to you. And some of those ports are finger piers with mobile harbour cranes and not much more. But they're getting very big ports calling, very big ships calling at them. So it is interesting how ships are still managing to get to these ports. And there's a very simple reason why. Because it's all about the cargo. And we've heard the expression already today, at least once, I think, cargo is king. We very easily get tied up talking about the bigger ships, but we mustn't forget the cargo, because ultimately it's all about the cargo and the need for the cargo to be served and for the ships to get in and out of those ports, because that's where the cargo is. Another big challenge, fragmented terminal capacity, that's really quite a difficult problem to overcome. The carriers are getting together in alliances. The cargo is, accumulating into larger lumps. The terminals, generally speaking, are more fragmented because of historical reasons. They've grown up over time. They served a certain purpose. They were of a certain scale. But the customer side has changed very suddenly overnight almost and become much bigger and much lumpier. So it's a question of physical fragmentation of terminals, but also in terms of the ownership of the terminals, particularly where some of those terminals are owned by carriers, so there's vested interests in the terminals. We're seeing a lot more inter-terminal transfer of boxes in different ports, and the US West Coast, as you probably know, has been particularly problematic in this respect, with a lot of fragmentation of terminals. There are a number of relatively small ports with a lot of terminals, a lot of small terminals, and the need to consolidate is there. I think the G6 traffic in Los Angeles, Long Beach, that business is spread across 5 different terminals. So there's a huge issue in terms of terminal fragmentation. And then there's a question of productivity, handling speeds, of course, which has again already come up today several times. The pressure or the demand for faster container handling. This is a depiction of crane intensity against crane production. So you've got the average number of cranes deployed on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, average moves per crane per hour, per individual crane. And talking to various people, over the last few months, who are much more learned than I am in terms of technical matters, 3,500, 3,600 moves in 24 hours seems to be a reasonable sort of upper limit of what you can achieve. Average crane intensity of 6, average production of 25 moves per hour. You can slide it up and down or, across, but you're still looking at that kind of ballpark. Corfu Khan comes out at about 4,300 moves in 24 hours. And that's a terminal, doing almost all transshipment, handling big ships, very large exchanges, pretty much every ingredient is there to be able to maximize the performance as best they can. So revolution or evolution, I don't think evolution can give the kind of performance that the industry is looking for. I think for that you have to be saying there has to be some kind of revolutionary change in handling technology, which comes at a cost and a risk. So just to finish up, overall supply chain network costs, this is the supply chain conference, so, and we have had all the sessions so far, which I think I've been very pleased to see have had a very, broad perspective on the overall transportation chain. And that's, that is increasingly significant now, I think, because there is an increasing imbalance that's evident. The shipping lines are driving down sea transport cost savings through bigger ships, and saving money for themselves, but generally it gets passed through to the customer, to the cargo owner. That's the way container shipping works. But it is clear that they're generating significantly higher costs in other parts of the supply chain, in particular at the moment ports and terminals. And there is a question mark about that, whether that imbalance, whether the seesaw is going to change to the point where those red costs are outweighing the green ones, where the economies from the ships get to the point where they generate such higher costs elsewhere in the supply chain that the overall system cost is higher. And to finish up, I thought I'd just, throw out there some potential solutions to help the discussion, really, of, what can we do about all of this? And I have a few of them which are in these kind of square blocks, which are kind of sort of solid solutions involving pouring concrete or investing in things made of steel. And terminal consolidation kind of falls into that category. This is one way of dealing with the issue, physically consolidating terminals, and in terms of ownership. But again, it's investment, it's costly, it's challenging. You can't just push two terminals together in a port if they're a mile apart. Higher terminal handling charges, you have to ask the question with all these higher costs. There's been a shift of costs and benefits within the system, more costs being pushed onto ports and terminals. Should they be asking for more money to get that, to shift that balance back again? Terminal automation, we've heard, right up front about terminal automation. Certainly that must be part of the solution in many locations, but I think we need to be very careful. If we think terminal solution is kind of a magic bullet that will solve all the productivity problems, then I think we're going to be disappointed. But it certainly has a role to play in helping the situation. As I mentioned in one of those earlier slides, maybe we have to have a revolution in ship-to-shore handling technology. The gantry crane design from Pacico in 1959, I think it started, hasn't really changed at all, has it? I know we've got drivers sitting in offices now instead of up in the cab, but really it's the same technology as 1959, really. And then I've got some fuzzy solutions in little clouds, because these are more sort of nebulous kind of ideas that don't involve pouring concrete or anything like that. But greater collaborations between terminals. Is there a need for ports to have kind of a single virtual terminal, or terminal alliances? Should terminals, start to work together more rather than compete in individual ports? We've got carrier alliances. Maybe we should have terminal alliances. Greater collaboration between terminals and carriers. I think that's almost a no-brainer, isn't it? That has to be part of the solution. Greater communication, cooperation to make it work. Greater cooperation between port authorities. We've seen Seattle and Tacoma coming closer together. Los Angeles, Long Beach are talking to each other. I think there's probably going to be a need for more port authority cooperation in local, neighbouring locations. And then last but not least, and this is probably the biggest, fuzziest cloud, changes in landside transportation and logistics, more organisational and structural change. There's a whole raft of things there, including, vehicle booking systems, but also this whole question of whether carrier alliances should operate on the land side as well as the seaside. And they should be actually cooperating much more in terms of inland distribution to get the benefits and to help cope with these peaks. And the whole question of data comes into here as well, I think, that's been mentioned already today. The need for much more sharing and transparency in terms of data about the availability of cargo and what's going on, so that all the parties involved can generate a more efficient inland distribution and logistics chain. So quite a few possible solutions, not all of them magical, most of them involving a lot of hard work and certainly some of them involving quite a bit of money as well, but hopefully some food for thought about the key issues. And with that, that is my last slide. So thank you very much for your attention.